Imagine for a second the sound of the ocean, but not as freedom. Imagine as a sentence.
Yeah.
The air in the hold of a ship, just thick with the sour smell of old fish and the metallic taste of fear. A rope is biting into your wrists. And just 6 days ago, you were a sister, singing Compline under a crucifix in the quiet of Lindisfarne.
And now?
Now you're just pressed between planks and bodies, and your whole world is suddenly defined by the rhythm of the waves and the sound of sailors laughing in a language you just don't understand.
That visceral experience right there, that sensory overload, that is exactly where we're going in this deep dive. Because for so long, the history of the Viking Age has been told through gold and fire and maps.
Right, the big picture stuff.
We focus on the high drama, the monumental sacrilege of 793 AD.
Exactly. When you think of Lindisfarne, you picture the date, the relics, the burned altars, the great theological offense. But today, our mission is a bit different.
A lot different.
We are zooming in way past those high-level historical annals, and we are trying to reconstruct the detailed daily fate of the women who were taken captive, specifically the nuns and other women from that Northumbrian monastery. We're looking for their faces, their names, their terrifying, practical struggle.
Which is an incredibly difficult task. I mean, let's be honest, those granular details were often deliberately omitted or just erased by the chroniclers who, they had other priorities.
So how do we even begin to do that?
Well, to pull this off, we have to triangulate. We've taken a deep dive into sources that are incredibly disparate. So we're unpacking the righteous outrage of contemporary letters like from Alcuin of York and putting them right alongside the much later, heavily edited Norse sagas.
And the third piece of that puzzle.
And this is maybe the most important piece, the silent, objective language of modern forensic evidence. We're talking isotopes, DNA, and just dedicated hard-nosed archaeology.
Okay, so let's frame this up. The central theme that ties all this together, it seems to be this painful, really complex transformation. We're tracking how a consecrated sister, devoted to God, became currency.
Literally currency, an asset.
And how the very violence that was intended to destroy the infrastructure of her faith, paradoxically, actually helped to spread it in the most intimate ways possible.
It is a profound study. I mean, it's about complexity, violation, and the unexpected persistence of the human spirit.
So let's start at the beginning. The moment their world just shattered. The initial catastrophe.
From sister to thrall.
793 AD. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it marks it so plainly. A year of terror. We all read the descriptions, right? The Viking ships like dragons on the sea. But the records from the immediate aftermath, they are so heavily biased, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And that bias is crucial to understanding the historical gap we're trying to fill here.
When we talk about sacrilege, the focus wasn't on the people, was it? It was on the stuff, the offense to God.
Precisely. The chroniclers, who were nearly all clergy, they were focused on the theological and, frankly, the monetary offense. The records confirm that monks died at the choir stalls. An abbess was likely killed in the cloister. But for writers like Alcuin of York,
who is maybe the most influential intellectual of his generation.
Without a doubt. And in his famous impassioned letters, the outrage is just laser-focused on the gold, the desecration of the relics, and the sheer shock of it all, the sacrilege.
His letter, they read like elegies, like he's mourning an entire civilization under assault. He's basically asking, how could God let this happen to us?
That's the core of it. His focus was on the metaphysical crisis. He wrote that the blood of the priests had been poured out around the altar. He obsessed over the relics, asking, did they tempt the pagans, or was this a failure of their protective power?
So he wasn't tracking the specific fates of the women taken.
Not at all. His primary concern was penance and moral failure. He saw the raid as divine punishment for the sins of the Northumbrian people. He wasn't thinking about individual suffering.
And the consequence of that focus, that theological and material focus, is what our sources call the violence of silence.
A really profound historical violence of omission. The Anglo-Saxon sources, they just don't give us names for the female victims. They give us the date, the place, the devastation, but they won't detail a single woman's life behind the devastatingly simple phrase, "Holy places are laid waste."
That silence, it's not just an accident, is it? It feels deliberate.
It's rooted in the institutional response. The church's public reaction was geared toward outrage, penance, and diplomatic action. But they failed to provide the instruments for immediate relief or to prioritize the human face of suffering over the spiritual offense.
Which implies a whole secondary layer of violence, doesn't it? That the historical record itself strips away their identity even before the Vikings physically did.
It absolutely does. The material violence of the raid was instantly compounded by the systemic violence of omission from their own culture. The very identity that defined her, the habit which named her sister, was torn off. Her life just evaporated. She went from having a spiritual title and institutional protection to being subject to immediate, brutal physical arithmetic.
The body as currency. That image is just so stark and it happens so fast.
It is the immediate and total devaluation of her former status. The sources describe this shift to purely economic measurement. I mean, the detail is there.
Yeah.
A man might shove his fingers under her jaw, examining her teeth to judge her worth.
Just like a horse.
Exactly like a horse. Women were inspected, measured by the constants of bodies and markets. Her identity was instantly replaced by her measurable physical value: health, age, teeth, scars, and critically presumed fertility.
And how quickly would that value change? I mean, was a woman valued differently on arrival in, say, Norway versus a year later after bearing a child?
The value was incredibly volatile. That initial inspection was all about maximizing profit on arrival. Youth and apparent health commanded the highest price, as did any specialized skills, which we'll get back to.
Right.
A year later, if she had successfully delivered a child, her value as a fertile vessel, it actually increased for the owner. But her value on the open slave market might decrease because of the wear and tear of childbirth, which was understood even then.
So the market was just ruthless.
Absolutely. Prioritizing reproductive and labor potential over everything else.
And this moves us from religious terms to the blunt, brutal terminology of captivity in Old Norse. What specific words do the later sources use for these women?
Well, the terminology reflects their new, degraded status with a kind of clinical clarity. The most common terms are friller and threes.
Threes, that's just a thrall, a slave.
Yes, threes is the Old Norse term for thrall. It designates a person as property. No rights, destined for heavy labor. Simple as that.
And friller, that translates roughly to concubine, but it's more complicated, isn't it?
Yes, we have to treat friller with some nuance. It does mean a concubine or a secondary wife, but it implies a specific social and legal status. A low-status partner, often a former thrall, who was recognized but lacked the full rights or inheritance claims of the main wife, the kona.
So the terms immediately categorize them, labor or reproduction.
Exactly. And historians also recover this really contested phrase, frill Christustina.
The Christian concubine.
The Christian concubine. The very existence of that phrase just summarizes the whole painful collision of forced identity. Christian belief paired with enslaved status.
Let's follow that journey by sea, because the source material provides these incredible visceral details about what that trip was like. It wasn't just physical hardship, it was a complete psychological reorientation.
The journey was designed to break the spirit. It was sustained, low-grade terror, and sensory deprivation. Imagine the relentless motion sickness pressed between wet planks and strangers. The air is thick with salt spray, vomit, sour provisions.
And the sound.
The only constant sound is the creaking of the ship and the incomprehensible, often frightening laughter of the men on deck. The captive's world just shrinks to those few feet of dark, cramped space.
And the source notes that their focus shifts entirely. It goes from the spiritual concerns of the cloister to the sharp certainty of hunger and this constant, merciless assessment of their own bodies.
Exactly. The philosophical debate over whether relics were a blessing or a temptation, that just vanishes. It gives way to the sharp, immediate question, will I eat today? Will I be touched? The world is redefined entirely by other people's calculation.
Based on age, teeth, scars.
It's the first fortnight where their very existence is defined by this merciless measurement, their stock. And the sailors check their stock. They separate the youngest from the oldest, the able from the broken. It is a calculated process of dehumanization.
And this is where the familiar names of the monastery, Abia's Elflided, Brother Tilwyn, they're just replaced by the names of the captors.
That clash of names, it signifies the complete collapse of her personal authority. The familiar names are now just whispers below deck, fragile memories she doesn't dare voice out loud.
And above them is the new law.
Above them is the crushing reality of the captain, a sea lord, a hafty who is her new absolute authority. The Anglo-Saxon sources didn't even bother to record his name, but for the captive, that captain's name is the new law. She has moved from the authority of the altar to the absolute physical authority of a man who wears a knife at his hip.
What a profound and immediate shift. The historical record emphasizes the treasure, the gold, the gospels, but the women themselves, there were the living, transportable, and reproductive capital that would ensure the future of these new settlements.
Which is why we have to dig deeper than the Chronicles, because once that journey ends, the violence shifts. It goes from the chaos of the raid to the systematic, legalistic, and ritualized process of turning them into permanent property.
So the journey ends, and the initial chaotic violence of the raid, it gives way to something much more structured. A legalistic process in the Norse world. This is where the transformation becomes permanent, right?
Exactly. This is where the physical transformation is solidified by law. They weren't just tossed onto a shore.
Yeah.
They were processed.
Just tell us about the arrival and this thrall house. What did that physical place actually look and feel like?
So the ship reaches a landing spot, probably along the coast we later see, named in Saga's Norway, the Orkneys, Iceland. They're taken, often in smaller boats, to a thrall house. And this isn't just a shed, it's a specific functional structure. It's a term archaeologists graft onto layers of earth and specific types of pottery.
So it's like the industrial wing of a farmstead.
That's a great way to put it. The industrial wing of the larger longhouse. It was functional, crowded, dimly lit. The air would have smelled perpetually of damp earth, stale sweat, and the heavy work that happened there. Milling grain, preparing wool, tanning hides.
This is the threshold where they're officially cataloged as property.
It is. And the washing process itself, it just illustrates the total lack of charity. They are washed, scrubbed down, maybe given some rough clothing, but it's not out of kindness. As the source states, it's because a thrall with lice fetches less at market.
So their physical maintenance is just an investment.
It's purely an investment in their economic value. The violence shifts from the sword to the ledger.
And it becomes a clinical assessment.
Absolutely clinical. A master, or maybe a trader's representative, often a woman with a scarred hand, suggesting she herself was a longtime thrall, or an overseer, stands and examines them, like a valuable beast of burden.
And the questions she asks are described as slashed questions. What does that mean?
It means they were delivered without warmth or pity. Short, sharp, purely functional. Can you bear children? Can you read? Do you know herbal cures? She thumbs their teeth, a universal sign to gauge age, health, and fertility.
Those questions are chilling because they immediately convert the woman's specialized former life, her religious identity, into exploitable market assets.
It is the ultimate profanation. A nun's literacy, the ability to copy scripture, becomes a household utility. Her knowledge of herbal cures, learned in the convent gardens, is converted into practical medicine for the household, not for charity.
And the source notes a crucial decision the captive has to make: to assert nothing. To be silent. Why was silence safer than even trying to assert yourself?
Because every assertion, every declaration of a skill could be used immediately to construct a sale at a higher price. Or it would increase their value to the master, which meant more intensive, demanding labor.
So if you say you can read,
You'll spend endless hours copying records or teaching children. If you say you know cures, you're responsible for the household's health. The source describes a moment of loud, defiant revolt from another woman screaming prayers to the saints, and it was met with instant, costly violence.
so loud resistance was punished.
Immediately. Survival often demanded calculated, pragmatic silence, invisibility.
And this processing, it leads directly to this horrific public ceremony, the ritual of blot and the blood bond. This seems critical because it's moving beyond the simple sale. It's ritualized legal domination.
This is the definitive spiritual and legal transformation, and it needs to be given its proper historical weight. The ritual, called a blot, was a public religious act, often involving sacrifice. It was designed to integrate the captive into the Norse legal and spiritual universe.
And what's fascinating here, as the source notes, is that this act is not private.
No, it's a public spectacle. It happens in a clearing or at an altar stone, a herger, and it's attended by the whole community. Men, women, children, neighbors. It's legal and spiritual theater designed to publicly transform the woman's standing.
Why so public?
Because later, when the sagas are written, this act is often referenced as a lawful claiming to legitimize the children born from these unions. It had to be witnessed.
So if we piece together the fragments, what exactly did this ritual entail for the captive?
The details are brutal and specific. The captive woman is often placed on the stone or standing near it. The gadi, who's both a priest and a secular chieftain, takes a bowl of blood, typically from a ritually slain animal, sometimes a horse, which was very significant in Norse belief.
And then the master.
The master cuts his own palm or arm, mixing his blood with the animal's blood. They bind hands and declare a blood bond, a formal act of ownership. This act transformed her into property in the eyes of Norse law. It completely removed her from the protection of her former religion, her family, her legal system.
This is the definitive demarcation line, the point of no return.
It is. She moves from the spiritual authority of her consecrated life to the permanent, violent authority of a man. And later observers, they struggle to categorize this. Sagas, written centuries later, often called it marriage or concubinage to justify the lineage of chieftains.
To make it more palatable.
Exactly, to make it palatable for a Christianized audience. And clerical writers, on the other hand, they just dismissed it as profanation and unchristian violence.
And neither narrative, the political one or the religious one, gives back what was taken.
Precisely. They are attempts by later generations to make the act comprehensible, but they fail to capture the immediate, profound destruction of selfhood that happened at that moment. It was an act of public spectacle, chosen deliberately for ritualized domination.
I just want to pause on that ritual and its legal weight. If a woman in Anglo-Saxon England was married, she had certain rights, dower rights. By undergoing the blot, was she stripped of all previous legal recognition, even if she were to escape later?
Absolutely. The act of the blood bond was a complete legal reset. The concept of property in Norse law was much harsher than in Anglo-Saxon law, especially for thralls. She lost any dower or inheritance rights she might have had.
And if she got back?
If she escaped and returned to England, her legal status was incredibly fraught. She was no longer a consecrated sister, and she was no longer a free, unmarried woman. The church struggled with women returning who had been, quote, polluted or who had borne children. It just shows how total that legal transformation was.
Which moves us into the next phase, the domestic reality that followed this legal trauma.
Yes, into the longhouse.
So the terror of the raid and the shock of that ritual, they give way to the grinding reality of daily life. The next chapter is the Norse household, which presents an entirely new set of threats and complexities, all wrapped up in the mundane.
And the initial environment is immediately sensory. The source notes, the first household you enter smells of peat and stale beer. This isn't just the master's world. It's the world of the master's wife, and this is where the captive woman's existence becomes most precarious.
The wife, the Kona, she's often the first point of complex conflict, viewing the new woman, the friller, as a rival, a status threat. But the source complicates this idea of simple victimhood.
And that's crucial. We have to recognize the nuanced social dynamics in the longhouse. The Kona may indeed see the captive as a threat to her own economic and social standing, but the source also notes there were sometimes small kindnesses.
Why? What would be the motivation for that?
Because both women, the wife and the captive, ultimately lived under the same man's absolute authority. They were both subject to his decisions. These small acts of humanity, they confound the idea of simple victimhood and demanded a really pragmatic navigation of these complex female relationships for the thrall's survival.
And survival then relied on converting their existing skills into what the source calls household capital. Let's elaborate on how a nun's education became domestic utility.
The skills that were once for God literacy, copying letters, knowledge of calendars, herbal cures, are immediately converted into tangible assets for the household. Literacy, in particular, was very scarce. The captive might be set to reading simple records, teaching the master's children the runes, or copying letters for trade.
And this is described as a quiet, private violence.
It is. The skills remain intact, but their sacred purpose has been utterly profaned by their new, purely economic function. The psychological toll of using a skill you dedicated to divine praise to now calculate profit and loss, it must have been immense.
And yet, there's a powerful act of resistance wrapped up in that very skill conversion, the transmission of secret faith.
This is the genius of clandestine survival. They were forced to speak to children in a language they didn't share. But while lulling an infant to sleep, they would repeat the names of saints or chant phrases from the choir, using them like protective threads, tethering a small life they never intended to produce.
So the act of teaching a child a prayer the master can't hear.
That's the quiet violence turned inward. Whispering Christian stories while kneading dough, preserving fragments of their former life in the one place the master couldn't fully control, the minds of the children.
Which leads us to the most defining and often most painful aspect of their new life, the political economy of the body. Fertility becomes wealth.
Starkly and brutally, Vikings prized fertility explicitly. Children were seen as vital strength and wealth for the lineage. The captive woman's body was, by default, an economic vessel.
And there was no protection.
No. In fact, becoming pregnant often solidified her place, because the household gained 2 laborers instead of 1. The child's fate was usually to be a thrall owned by the master.
And the reality of childbirth under these conditions must have been brutal, especially compared to the care she might have had in a convent.
The contrast was terrifying. Births were attended by other thralls, unprofessional laborers, not the trained midwives or herbalists you'd find in monastic setting. Mortality for both mother and child was astronomically high.
And we need to acknowledge the physical reality of that.
We do. The source mentions the physical reality of severe obstetric injury. Terms like obstetric fistula and incontinence, these only appear in modern medical scholarship.
Why do modern scholars have to use those technical medical terms?
Because the historical sources, the sagas and chronicles, they offered no language for women's suffering that wasn't purely narrative or moral. They recorded the birth of a chieftain's son, but not the physical devastation of the mother. So historians have to rely on medical terminology to describe the physical reality of repeated trauma, chronic pain, infection, debilitating disability. Science is giving voice to suffering the contemporary world refused to name.
This created what the source calls ambiguous ties. The children tether them, complicating their identity and their survival strategy.
It's a fascinating psychological contradiction. The women both feared these forced births, but they also hungered for them. The children provided visibility, a human tie that sometimes guarded against the worst random cruelties.
So they provided a purpose.
A purpose, but it was also a double erasure. The loss of the convent life and the forming of new, morally complex, non-consensual ties to the captor's world.
So if open rebellion was too costly, survival relied on these acts of hidden endurance. What were the specific daily strategies for spiritual survival?
The strategy shifted entirely to what you could call a secret economy of survival. How to hide a cross, how to braid your hair in a certain way, how to make your body less visible to hands that count. Tiny, cunning, private rituals that kept a flame of their former identity alive.
Give us some examples. This clandestine devotion, what did it look like and what were the risks?
The devotion was carried out in secret, and often with high personal risk. Imagine a woman carving a tiny cross on a scrap of wood, maybe the bottom of a bowl or a spindle whorl, and tucking it under a mattress where the master wouldn't look.
Or scratching psalms into pottery.
Exactly. Scratching faint, almost invisible psalms into the rim of a clay pot while she was alone spinning thread. Mouthing a psalm while kneading bread, the most intimate household work becoming a moment of prayer.
But these acts were dangerous. What were the punishments if a thrall was discovered practicing a foreign religion?
The punishments were designed to be painful and humiliating, reinforcing their status as property. You could face a public beating, physical restraint, or the extremely humiliating act of having your head shaved, which marked you as property and removed any last vestige of social grace.
And branding.
Sometimes we see mention of burnt marks, a type of branding used to permanently mark a thrall who is deemed recalcitrant. The goal was always to reduce them back into a compliant instrument.
But these small hidden acts had monumental weight in the long run, didn't they? They became the vector of transmission.
They did. That hidden faith was a stubborn ember. The small act of teaching a child the sign of the cross or whispering the story of a saint, that child might use that gesture decades later when Christianity became politically viable in Scandinavia. The minute acts you commit have weight you do not measure.
Let's touch on ransom. We hear stories of escape or ransom. Was this a genuine hope for most of them?
It was exceptionally rare. But stories did circulate, serving as both hope and warning. There are records in king's ledgers of ransoms being paid, usually through agents in trade hubs like Dublin. But these were the clear exceptions. The vast majority were assimilated.
And even if they did get back?
Even then, they faced profound challenges. They were often met with suspicion, especially over bearing children abroad. It shows the church's struggle to process this new, unprecedented moral and social reality.
It paints a picture of pragmatic, morally chaotic survival.
Where every choice had a complex ethical cost.
Okay, so now we need to shift gears a bit. We've talked about the lived experience, which we've reconstructed from fragments and painful conjecture. Now let's talk about the methodology. This is where historians become detectives, right? Using these diverse, often conflicting sources to build a picture of what the sources themselves tried to erase.
Exactly. This is the how we know what we know part.
We started by discussing the institutional silence of the church. So where, if not in the main chronicles, did the women's stories survive? What were these textual gaps and oblique traces?
Well, their stories survive in the margins. Sometimes literally. We find these oblique records in the corners of documents. A marginal note with a woman's English name written hastily beside a tax receipt, or a king's ledger remarking on a ransom paid for 3 Christian women.
So not a narrative, just administrative noise.
Administrative noise, fragments of legal record, biographical footnotes, a single line in a much later Icelandic saga naming an English mother for a prominent Norwegian chieftain. And then we have the sagas themselves.
Which are the most narrative-rich sources we have, but they come with huge complications.
Huge. And we have to ask the critical question.
Huh.
How can we trust these sagas at all if they're openly serving a political purpose? Justifying lineage and family honor isn't just a convenient fiction.
It's a great question.
They were codified in the 12th and 13th centuries, preserving older oral traditions, but they're absolutely literary artifacts. They're shaped by the political needs of powerful families and filtered through the pen of Christian scribes. They are not historical documents in the modern sense.
But they're not useless.
Not at all, because when historians cross-reference them, they reveal a consistent, crucial motif that foreign women became persistent vectors of change within Norse households.
Can you give us an example of how that plays out in a well-known saga?
Sure. Consider the Laxdala Saga or the Eagle Saga. These texts often include episodes with foreign women, usually English or Irish, who were captive or acquired as secondary wives. In Eagle Saga, the lineage includes women who bring literacy or poetic ability into the family. Even if the details are embellished, the persistent presence of this knowledgeable foreign mother suggests a deep-seated cultural memory that these women introduced new practices.
Whether it was literacy, textile arts, or Christian belief.
Critically Christian belief.
Oh,
Which brings us back to that contested term you mentioned earlier, the frill Christustina.
the Christian concubine.
Its historical use is debated. Was it a legal term or just a slur? But its very existence in Norse texts implies a recognition of women who were held captive, maintained a Christian identity, and yet still fulfilled the role of a friller. It's a phrase that forces us to hold these conflicting ideas of faith, bondage, and forced integration all at once.
So, where the texts are silent or biased, we have to turn to science and stone, the forensic anchors. What can archaeology and science tell us that the chroniclers refuse to write down?
Archaeology contributes a language that is intimate, immediate, and confirms the movement of bodies. The bones cannot lie.
Tell us about the skeletal evidence. What specific indicators does osteology, the study of bones, reveal?
Osteology has been incredibly revealing, especially in Norse settlements in Iceland, the Orkneys, and parts of Norway. Skeletal remains from the early medieval period often show distinct indicators of repeated, difficult childbirth.
How can you see that on a skeleton?
You see changes to the pelvic architecture, specifically stress markers on the pubic symphysis. We also find evidence of lives marked by continuous hard labor, specific stress markers around muscle attachment sites that indicate constant strain from repetitive work, like grinding grain at a cornstone.
So you can literally see their daily work on their bones.
You can. We find evidence of vertebral compression and healed fractures that suggest lives of unrelenting physical toil and, tragically, sometimes physical violence. The material record confirms the physical consequences.
And then the modern science, isotopes, and genetics can tell us where these women were before captivity.
That's the stunning utility of isotopic analysis. We look at the chemical signatures locked into their teeth. Yeah, tooth enamel preserves the chemical signature of the local water and food you consumed during early childhood because it doesn't regenerate. We look at the ratios of strontium and oxygen isotopes. If a body is found in Norway, but the teeth show a ratio consistent with the geology of, say, Northumbria, we have a factual anchor.
So the teeth are a permanent passport.
Exactly. It proves these women came from the British Isles or Ireland. DNA studies further confirm this on a large demographic scale, showing traces of British and Irish maternal ancestry, the mtDNA, in Scandinavian populations from that period.
But you stressed the limits of this science earlier. How do we not overread the DNA results?
We had to be so careful. DNA confirms movement, but it cannot name trauma or faith. It can't tell us if the woman was captured or traded or a free settler. It can't tell us if she was a Christian or if she laughed with her children or wept herself awake at night. The trauma is inferred by cross-referencing the DNA with the osteology and the textual context.
The graves with hybrid iconography, those are incredibly powerful examples of this collision.
They are powerful beyond measure. Proof that the boundary between conqueror and captive was porous, and this complexity persisted even after death. The specific example of a woman's grave may be in the Orkneys, with both a Christian cross and a Thor's hammer. That is a historian's goldmine.
What psychological state does that combination even suggest?
It suggests suspended loyalties, profound ambivalence, or maybe a pragmatic hedge against the uncertainties of the afterlife. Was it the Norse master trying to ensure she got to the right place? Was it her Christian child placing the cross secretly alongside the public hammer? We don't know, but the object itself forces us to recognize the complex hybrid identity that emerged from assimilation.
And these domestic objects of devotion, the cross carved into a tool, they provide the whispers of private devotion that survived.
Yes, a spindle, well, a tool of women's domestic labor carved with a tiny, inconspicuous Christ cross hidden in the layers of a longhouse. These are not grand religious statements. They are minute, secret acts that testify to the quiet persistence of faith in the face of absolute coercion.
This entire triangulation, the political silence, the filtered sagas, the brutal anchor in the bones, it leads us to the uncomfortable, unforeseen legacy of this violence.
And this is the bitter irony we have to confront. The violence was intended to humiliate and destroy the Christian faith in Northumbria. Yet the actions of the raiders, by transporting these women, ultimately helped spread that faith in ways the perpetrators never foresaw.
Because these women became unwitting and often unwilling agents of conversion.
Absolutely crucial agents. Their role was indispensable. They maintained devotion within the households, teaching children, preserving small objects of veneration. This domestic religion became the private roots for later political conversions.
How did that actually influence politics later on?
Well, when conversion was formalized by kings like Olaf Tryggvason or Harold Bluetooth, it was an elite political process. But that process was only sustainable because the groundwork had already been laid domestically. Many of these kings, or their most influential followers, had English or Irish mothers or grandmothers who had taught them prayers in secret. The captive women made the Christian worldview familiar.
Which smoothed the path for later political adoption.
Exactly. The quiet acts they committed laid the cultural architecture for major political shifts decades later.
And their knowledge, the literacy, the herbal cures, was also transferred, benefiting the Norse settlements materially.
That practical clerical knowledge became indelible household capital across Scandinavia. The women who became midwives in new lands carried the memories of the convent gardens in their hands. Their literacy ensured their children carried clerical knowledge into legal and domestic contexts, shaping early medieval Scandinavia's administrative and cultural practices.
It's a profound, if devastating, example of the ethical cost of cultural transfer.
Yes, and the cost was not abstract. It was paid in bodies, in trauma, and in forced assimilation. The woman who carved a cross into a spoon might, without knowing it, teach her grandson to read a prayer aloud in a king's hall. This complexity prevents us from painting the violence as simple destruction. It was destruction that led to unforeseen transformation, purchased at the highest price.
So let's try to synthesize everything we've uncovered in this deep dive. We've tracked these two parallel and often contradictory narratives running side by side.
On one hand, you have the high cost of violence borne by the women, the trauma, the forced assimilation, and the intentional erasure from the historical chronicles that preferred to count the gold.
And on the other hand,
On the other, we see this unforeseen legacy, the quiet, resilient spread of Christian knowledge and practical skills that slowly, domestically, helped shape early medieval Scandinavia.
the scale and texture of these lives, the fact that these women left tangible genetic and cultural traces that persist across centuries, that is the true hidden archive we were looking for.
It is, and it places a real ethical demand on us as listeners, as students of history. We have to resist the temptation to aestheticize suffering or to romanticize survival as some neat, heroic story.
Because it wasn't neat.
Not at all. Survival was pragmatic and morally chaotic. It included concealment, resistance, and at times necessary collaboration with their captors for the sake of their children or their own lives. We have to tell the story without softening the violence or minimizing the sheer, raw resourcefulness it took to endure.
So the most honest image we're left with, it's not the grand narrative of Viking expansion, it's the quiet devastation inside the longhouse.
It's the small scale that matters. The women's bones, their blood, their children remained. Their suffering enabled shifts in power and belief. The chroniclers loved the drama of burned altars, but the women's faith persisted in hidden gestures, cross-scratched spoons, and whispered prayers.
Becoming the architecture of secrecy within the very culture that sought to erase them.
That persistence is not a consolation for the pain. It's simply unyielding evidence of human endurance in its most uncompromising form.
The chronicle entries count the gold, but the sagas and the graves count the movement of bodies and faith. We've reconstructed a life here defined entirely by another's law, where the smallest, most private act, a carved cross, a whispered psalm, was the only true act of defiance left.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. We've seen how the persistence of the smallest, most hidden cultural fragment can change history over centuries. If your life were suddenly defined by another's law, what fragments of your own culture, your own beliefs, or your own self would you risk everything to preserve?
The cost of endurance is high, but the price of forgetting that archive is even higher. Thank you for diving deep with us.